Sojourner Truth, the voice that could not be silenced. Born in chains, forged in fire. The year was 1797. A bitter winter wind swept across the Hudson Valley of New York, rattling the wooden beams of a modest farmhouse. Inside a small cabin, built not for comfort but for necessity, a cry pierced the cold night. A child had been born, not into freedom, not into promise, but into bondage. Her name at birth was Isabella Baumfree. To her parents, she was Belle, a fragile spark of hope in a world that had known little kindness. Her father, James, was a tall man from the Gold Coast of Africa, stolen from his homeland and forced into a life of servitude. Her mother, Elizabeth, known as Bet, carried the memory of Africa in her lullabies and whispered prayers. They had endured the unendurable, and now, with this child, they prayed she might endure too. But prayers were fragile things in a world where people were treated as property. From her very first breath, Isabella belonged to someone else. Her cradle was not her own, her future not hers to claim. She was counted among the livestock, a line on an inventory sheet, valued not for her soul but for the strength her body might one day yield. Childhood in chains. Belle grew quickly. She had her mother's searching eyes and her father's strength. Yet the world around her was merciless. She was still a child when she first tasted the raw cruelty of slavery. At an age when children should chase sunlight through fields and laugh at shadows, Belle was already bent under labor. She carried heavy loads of wool, fetched water until her arms ached, and endured beatings when her small body could not meet the demands of grown men. Her earliest memories were not of safety or tenderness, but of the sound of her mother weeping softly at night. Elizabeth would gather her children close, telling them stories of a God who saw beyond the cruelty of man, a God who promised freedom even to those in chains. "Trust in him," her mother whispered, "and you will one day be free." But freedom was a distant dream. By the time Belle was 9, she had been sold. Torn from her family, placed on an auction block, she stood trembling as strangers measured her arms, inspected her teeth, discussed her worth as if she were cattle. She was sold for $100, and a herd of sheep. To be valued less than livestock, this was the beginning of her journey through hell. The cruelty of new masters. Her new master was violent and brutal. He spoke only English. Belle, who had grown up speaking Dutch, did not yet understand the language. When she failed to obey, when she could not understand, the whip taught her in the language of pain. Night after night, lash after lash, the stripes across her back carved a grim education, that in the eyes of her oppressors she was not a child, not a girl, not a human being, but a possession, a tool to be broken and reshaped at their will. And yet, something within her refused to break. Through the agony, through the loneliness, Belle began to cultivate an inner strength, a voice deep inside that whispered, "I will not be crushed. I will endure. My life will mean more than this." She remembered her mother's words, "God sees you." And in those long nights of pain, Belle began to believe that if God could see her, then she was not invisible. If he could hear her cries, then her voice mattered, even if the world around her denied it. The seeds of defiance. Years passed, and with each new master came new trials. She was sold again, this time into the household of John Dumont. Dumont was harsh, but Belle was older now, stronger, and her faith had become an unshakable root. It was in Dumont's household that her spirit began to stir with the first signs of defiance. She worked tirelessly, often doing the labor of several men in the fields. Dumont himself marveled at her strength, admitting that she could outwork most of his hired hands. But still, he treated her as less than human. Here, Belle fell in love. His name was Robert, another enslaved man from a nearby farm. Their love was tender, born in stolen glances and whispered promises beneath the moonlight. But when Dumont's overseers discovered them, their romance was shattered. Robert was beaten nearly to death, and the two were forced apart forever. The cruelty of slavery was not only in the chains, not only in the whip, but in the systematic breaking of hearts. Belle carried that wound for the rest of her life. Yet the pain did not make her weaker. It sharpened her resolve. The dream of freedom. By her late 20s, Belle had borne several children. Each child was born into the same bondage she had known, and with each birth her determination grew fiercer. She could endure the lash. She could endure hunger. But she could not endure the thought of her children growing up enslaved. In 1826, Dumont made her a promise: he would grant her freedom a year before New York officially abolished slavery. But when the time came, he broke his word. Belle, realizing that her life and her children's futures would always be shackled unless she took a stand, made a decision that would change history. One autumn night, with her infant daughter Sophia in her arms, she slipped away from Dumont's farm. The Hudson Valley lay quiet under the stars as she walked into the unknown. She had no map, no money, no certainty. Only faith. "I did not run off," she would later say. "I walked away by daylight, believing God would help me." And he did. She found shelter with the Van Wagenen family, who offered her safety and refused to return her to Dumont. It was the first taste of freedom, but it came at a terrible price. A mother's anguish. Dumont had already sold one of her sons, Peter, illegally, to a plantation owner in the South. For Belle, this was an unendurable theft. Most enslaved mothers never saw their children again once sold southward. But Belle was not like most. She did the unthinkable: she went to court. In a system designed to silence women, especially black women, especially those who had once been enslaved, she dared to raise her voice before a judge. With courage and persistence, she argued that her son had been taken unlawfully. Against all odds, she won. It was 1828. For the first time in American history, a black woman successfully challenged a white man in court, and triumphed. When young Peter was placed back into her arms, Belle wept. It was not only a victory for herself, not only for her son, but for every enslaved mother whose voice had been stolen. Belle had proven that justice could be forced to listen. This victory planted the seed of something greater, a belief that her voice, magnified by faith and truth, could move mountains. The Awakening. By the 1830s, Isabella Baumfree was free, at least in body. But her soul, her destiny, had only begun to unfold. She began to experience visions, spiritual awakenings, and a powerful sense that she was chosen for a divine purpose. She felt compelled to travel, to speak, to tell the truth as God revealed it to her. And so, in 1843, she shed the name Isabella Baumfree. With the fire of prophecy in her heart, she declared to the world: "The Spirit calls me, and I must go. From this day, I am Sojourner Truth." A name not given by masters, not inherited from bondage, but chosen. A name that carried the weight of destiny. She was no longer just a survivor of slavery. She was becoming a messenger of freedom. Part 2, The Making of a Prophet. A new name, a new destiny. The year was 1843. The sun rose over the Hudson River, casting its golden light upon the hills of New York. In that light walked a woman reborn. She was no longer Isabella Baumfree, the enslaved child who had endured lashes, auctions, and the tearing apart of her family. She was now Sojourner Truth, a name that carried the weight of heaven and the burden of prophecy. Sojourner, she declared, because I must travel. Truth, because it is the word God has given me to speak. With nothing but faith in her heart and fire in her soul, she left behind the life she had known. She stepped onto the open road, not knowing where her feet would carry her, but knowing why she walked, to proclaim the truth that freedom belonged to all, women were the equal of men, and justice was the command of God Himself. The road beckons. Sojourner traveled from town to town, village to village. She had no riches, no possessions, no worldly power. She carried only her voice, a voice that could thunder like a storm or soften into a lullaby. When she spoke, people listened. Farmers, tradesmen, housewives, skeptics, all gathered to hear the tall, commanding woman with a gaze that pierced to the soul. Some mocked her, others dismissed her. But many were moved. Her words carried an undeniable authority, not from books or polished education, but from the furnace of lived suffering and divine conviction. She spoke of slavery, not as an abstract evil but as wounds carved into her very flesh. She spoke of womanhood, not as an ornament to be placed upon a pedestal, but as strength forged in childbirth, labor, and endurance. And always, she spoke of God, a God who sided not with kings or masters, but with the broken, the enslaved, the forgotten. Trials of the Prophet. The road was not easy. Many doors were closed to her. In taverns and town squares, hecklers jeered at her, calling her a liar, a fool, even a witch. Men questioned her womanhood, mocking her height and strength. Some accused her of being a man in disguise. But Sojourner never cowered. When insults were hurled, she met them with a steady gaze. When stones were thrown, she lifted her voice higher. Once, when skeptics doubted her gender, she bared her breast before the crowd and declared, "I have borne children. Ain't I a woman?" Her defiance silenced even the cruelest tongues. She had lived too much truth to be undone by lies. The spirit of fire. Her preaching was unlike the polished sermons of ministers in their pulpits. She did not rely on rhetoric or philosophy. She spoke with raw fire, words pouring forth as if dictated by the heavens themselves. "I feel so tall within," she cried, "as if the power of God were upon me. And when I speak, it comes forth like a rushing mighty stream." People who came expecting to see a curiosity often left shaken, transformed. Some wept openly, confessing their sins of prejudice. Others pledged themselves to the abolitionist cause. Even those who resisted found themselves haunted by her voice long after she was gone. Encounters with great minds. As her reputation spread, Sojourner crossed paths with the great abolitionists of her time, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Lucretia Mott, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Douglass, himself a man who had escaped slavery, once thundered about the hopelessness of the enslaved. "We must take up arms," he declared, "for nothing else will free us." Sojourner rose, her voice calm but unyielding. "Frederick, is God gone?" The question fell heavy upon the room. Douglass bowed his head. Even he, the great orator, was humbled by her faith. To her, the abolitionist struggle was not only political, it was spiritual war. And in that war, despair was the enemy as much as slavery itself. The women's rights movement. It was in 1851, in Akron, Ohio, that Sojourner delivered the words that would forever etch her into history. The Women's Rights Convention was in full swing, filled with speeches from educated, white women demanding equality. Many in the audience doubted that black women had a place in this struggle. Some even argued that women were too weak, too delicate for the responsibilities of political life. Sojourner rose. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in plain Quaker gray, she strode to the front of the hall. The murmurs quieted. She fixed the assembly with her piercing gaze and began. "Children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter." And then, with rising thunder in her voice, she challenged them all. "That man over there says women need to be helped into carriages, and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages, or over mud puddles, or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? I have plowed, and planted, and gathered into barns. And no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man, when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? The room fell silent. Some wept. Others trembled. None could deny the power of her truth. In that moment, Sojourner united two great causes, the struggle against slavery and the struggle for women's rights. She declared that the freedom of one could not be separated from the freedom of the other. Rising as a national voice. From that day forward, Sojourner Truth became more than a preacher, more than a former slave. She became a symbol. Newspapers across the North carried accounts of her speeches. Writers described her as a towering figure, with a voice that could shake rafters and a faith that could shake mountains. Some feared her. Others revered her. But all recognized that she could not be ignored. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famed author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote an article about her, calling her, the Libyan Sibyl, a prophetess whose presence seemed larger than life. The shadow of danger. But her boldness carried danger. The years leading up to the Civil War were perilous for abolitionists. Pro-slavery mobs often attacked speakers. Churches were burned. People were lynched. Sojourner traveled fearlessly into hostile towns, places where her very presence was a provocation. She faced threats, taunts, even attempts on her life. But she pressed on, declaring, "The Spirit calls me, and I will not turn back. Truth is my sword, faith is my shield, and no weapon formed against me shall prosper." Her courage became legendary. She walked through hatred as if it were smoke, never letting it choke the fire within her. Closing of Part 2. By the dawn of the 1860s, Sojourner Truth had become one of the most powerful voices in America. She had walked out of slavery, walked into freedom, and now walked across the land as a prophet, a preacher, and a warrior for justice. She had stood before crowds who doubted her, before men who scorned her, before systems that sought to silence her. And still she spoke. Because Sojourner Truth knew this, a voice born of suffering, sanctified by faith, and sharpened by courage could never be silenced. Her greatest battles, however, were yet to come. The nation itself would soon tear apart in civil war, and Sojourner would step onto that battlefield not with a sword, but with the weapon of her truth. Part 3, War, Freedom, and the Fire of Justice. The nation at the brink. By the early 1860s, the United States was a land divided. The North and South stood on the edge of destruction, the question of slavery tearing the nation apart. The voices of abolition had grown louder, the cries of the enslaved more desperate, and the fury of slaveholders more unyielding. It was in this crucible of conflict that Sojourner Truth's voice reached its sharpest pitch. For decades she had preached, traveled, thundered against injustice. Now history itself was catching fire, and she knew that her mission was entering its most dangerous, most necessary hour. Calling the free to arms. When President Abraham Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, enslaved people across the South began to flee plantations, rushing toward Union lines. Thousands of black men sought to enlist in the Union Army, to fight not just for a divided nation, but for the liberation of their people. Sojourner was there, urging them on. She stood in recruitment meetings, her tall frame towering over the crowds, her voice booming with conviction. "My brothers, this is your hour. The Lord has opened the door of deliverance, and you must walk through it like men. Take up arms, not for vengeance, but for freedom. Prove to this nation that the sons of Africa shall no longer bow, but stand upright in the sight of God and man." Her words struck deep. Men who had known only chains signed their names with trembling hands, choosing to fight for liberty even at the cost of their lives. Ministering to the wounded. But Sojourner did not only recruit soldiers. She went where few dared to go, into the camps, into the hospitals, into the crowded shelters of the freed people. She washed wounds. She prayed over dying men whose blood stained the soil of freedom. She sang hymns to mothers searching for lost children, comforted fathers who feared they would never find work in a land that still despised their color. In the refugee camps, she saw hunger, disease, despair. And yet, she also saw hope, children running free for the first time, men learning to read their own names, women lifting their heads without fear of the overseer's lash. She became their advocate. Again and again, she traveled to Washington, petitioning officials, demanding better conditions for freed slaves. Some brushed her aside. Others listened. None could ignore her persistence. The meeting with Lincoln. In 1864, Sojourner Truth entered the White House. President Abraham Lincoln himself received her, a moment unthinkable just a generation earlier, when she had been counted as property worth less than livestock. She looked upon the tall, weary man, the weight of the nation heavy upon his shoulders. Lincoln, in turn, regarded the woman whose name had spread across the country as a living emblem of freedom. He showed her the signed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. She nodded solemnly. "Mr. President," she said, "I am here because my people are suffering. The freedmen need land, need work, need protection. Freedom without these is not freedom at all." Lincoln listened carefully, assuring her of his commitment. For Sojourner, the meeting was not about flattery or prestige. It was about holding the leader of the nation accountable to the promise of justice. Faith in the midst of war. As the war dragged on, with its endless death tolls and rivers of blood, Sojourner clung to her faith. She believed, with unshakable certainty, that God's hand was moving through the chaos. When others despaired, she lifted their eyes toward hope. "Children," she would say, "God is not blind, and he is not asleep. The Pharaoh of this land shall not prevail. The Red Sea is before us, and freedom lies on the other side. But we must walk through the waters with courage." To many, she became more than a speaker, more than a reformer. She became a prophet in their midst, a living reminder that slavery was not just a crime against a people, but a sin against heaven. Victory, and new struggles. In 1865, the guns finally fell silent. The Confederacy collapsed. The Union had triumphed. And with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished across the United States. Sojourner wept when the news reached her. She had lived to see the chains broken, the auction blocks shattered, the whip silenced. But her joy was tempered by reality. Freedom was not the end of struggle, it was only the beginning. The freed people had no land, no money, no security. Many faced violence from angry whites who refused to accept their liberation. The promise of equality was fragile, threatened at every turn. Sojourner threw herself into this new battle. She traveled the country, demanding land grants for freed families, speaking against discrimination, calling for justice that was more than words on paper. "We have been freed," she declared, "but what good is freedom if we cannot live? We must have our rights as citizens, our share in this land, or else the chains shall return in another form." A symbol for a nation. As the years passed, Sojourner Truth became a living legend. Her very presence carried weight. Children were brought to meet her as one might be brought before a monument. Young women looked upon her as proof that courage could rise from suffering. Artists painted her likeness. Writers recorded her words. Audiences stood in awe as she spoke of the days when she had been sold for $100 and a herd of sheep, and of the God who had lifted her from those chains to stand before presidents. She was no longer just Sojourner the preacher, nor even Sojourner the abolitionist. She had become Sojourner the symbol, a walking embodiment of freedom's triumph, and of the long road still ahead. Closing of Part 3. The Civil War had ended. The law now declared slavery abolished. But the work of true equality remained unfinished, fragile, and perilous. And Sojourner Truth, weary, scarred, yet unbroken, pressed on. She had faced the lash. She had walked away from bondage. She had thundered before crowds, inspired armies, and looked a president in the eye. But she was not finished. For her vision of freedom was larger than emancipation. It was a vision of justice for all, women as well as men, black as well as white, poor as well as rich. The war was over. But the struggle was not. Part 4, The Eternal Echo of Freedom. After the war. The guns were silenced. The battlefields of America, once stained with rivers of blood, now lay quiet beneath the sun. The Civil War was over. But for Sojourner Truth, the war for justice had only entered a new chapter. The Emancipation Proclamation had torn the chains. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery in law. But the reality was crueler. Freed families wandered homeless, jobless, hunted by violence, betrayed by promises that dissolved in the heat of politics. Sojourner saw it with her own eyes. She saw mothers clutching children in rags, fathers begging for land to till, young men beaten for daring to walk free. Freedom had come, but without land, without security, it was freedom in name only. The land question. Sojourner raised her voice again, this time for the cause of land for the freedmen. If the government can give land to soldiers, if it can grant land to railroads, she thundered, then it can give land to the children of bondage who have watered this soil with their sweat and tears. She traveled to Washington, petitioning Congress, meeting officials, demanding that freed families be given 40 acres and a mule, a chance to stand on their own feet. But promises were broken. The dream of land for the freed died in the halls of politics. Sojourner grieved, but she did not surrender. We must keep knocking, she told the freed people. For if we stop, the door will never open. Champion of women's rights. As the years turned, Sojourner became as fierce a voice for women as she had been for the enslaved. She traveled to conventions, stood before skeptical crowds, and declared that the fight for freedom was incomplete without women's equality. I have as much muscle as any man, she proclaimed, flexing her arm before astonished audiences. I can do as much work, eat as much, endure as much, and bear children besides. And ain't I a woman? Her words rang like thunder across America. She was a living contradiction to every lie told about women's weakness, about black inferiority. She embodied the truth that equality could no longer be denied. Battles against time. The years pressed heavily upon her body. Her tall frame grew stooped, her hair whitened, her steps slowed. Yet the fire in her eyes never dimmed. She continued to travel, to speak, to inspire. Crowds rose in ovation when she entered a hall, for they knew they were in the presence of history itself, not just a witness to freedom, but its embodiment. But with age came pain. Old wounds throbbed. The scars of lashes, the years of toil, the endless miles of travel wore upon her flesh. Still, she pressed forward. When asked why she did not rest, she answered simply. I cannot rest while there is injustice in the land. The final years. In her later years, Sojourner settled in Battle Creek, Michigan. There, surrounded by children and grandchildren, she continued her mission, writing letters, receiving visitors, giving speeches whenever her strength allowed. She became a revered elder, a prophet whose very presence seemed to radiate the survival of a people. She told stories of her childhood in Dutch, the language of her first tongue. She prayed in English, the language of her adopted cause. And she dreamed in truth, the language of eternity. On November 26, 1883, at the age of 86, Sojourner Truth drew her last breath. Her body, once bent beneath the weight of slavery, now lay still. But her voice, that voice forged in suffering, strengthened in faith, and unleashed in thunder, could not be silenced. Legacy. Sojourner Truth left behind no riches, no monuments of stone, no armies, no empires. What she left was greater. A testimony that a woman born enslaved could rise to challenge presidents. A witness that faith could turn suffering into power. A voice that united the causes of abolition and women's rights into one cry for universal justice. Today, her name is etched in the halls of history, her face carved in bronze, her words echoed in classrooms, her spirit invoked in struggles for equality around the world. She is remembered not only as a woman of her time but as a voice for all time. And if one listens closely, across the centuries, her question still rings. Ain't I a woman? Closing. So ended the life of Sojourner Truth. Born in chains, yet died free. Mocked as a slave, yet honored as a prophet. Forgotten by masters, yet remembered by history. She was, and forever shall be, the voice that could not be silenced.